The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Pedro Sánchez Pérez-Castejón, President of the Government of Spain. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have a great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Pedro Sánchez Pérez-Castejón, President of the Government of Spain, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Señor Presidente, Secretario General.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, heads of state and government, ambassadors and delegates, rarely have the foundations of this institution been shaken as strongly as in the early hours of 24 February, when cities throughout Ukraine felt the terror of Russian bombardments. More than 6 months later, we are still witness to the horror of an invasion that takes us back to times we believed we had left behind in Europe. Yesterday, Putin continued his headlong rush with totally unacceptable statements. And from this platform and what it represents, I want to say to all of you that I wish to condemn in the strongest terms the announcement of the annexation referendums in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson. These false referendums would constitute a new violation of international law by Vladimir Putin. Let me be clear, the results will never be recognized. We will continue to support what we've always supported here, that being independence, sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Precisely now is when we need to act united in defense of the principles, those enshrined in the UN Charter, and in support of a country that has been attacked, Ukraine. This war seeks to rob the sovereign people of Ukraine of their legitimate right to exist in peace and freedom, and it has condemned the entire world, because this is a global crisis, to an era of uncertainty going on right now, right when we were on the cusp of a well-deserved era of optimism, just after humanity had successfully set in motion the greatest scientific and humanitarian cooperation effort of its entire history to combat COVID-19. In these uncertain times, the economic and social consequences of the war are a threat to global prosperity, especially the most vulnerable countries. A food crisis that has been central to the General Assembly's debate here at the United Nations. We also see an energy crisis provoked by an autocrat who will stop at nothing to stay in power. He will use any instrument as a weapon of war. The impact that this has had on prices, already rising due to the supply chain disruptions that we've seen over the last year, threatens to leave the world's poorest even poorer. It's not hard to understand why many people feel that they have had enough, especially young people. That's who I'm thinking of, born at the start of this new millennium, a generation that, as well as confronting this new crisis in their lives, is living under the very real threat of the climate emergency and its consequences for the world that they will inherit. But despite all that, I am certain that there where danger lies, there too lies our salvation. That is why today I would like to extend an unequivocal message of trust and confidence. Trust in the capacity of the international community to overcome any adversity. And confidence. Confidence in the strength of an institution such as the United Nations to rise up against challenges that know no borders. Allow me to focus this reflection on 5 major challenges for all of you. The first one being the commitment to global health. The second is the food crisis. The third, the ecological transition. The fourth, the digital transition. And fifth, true effective equality between men and women. Concerning global health, it is essential that we learn from the lessons of our fight against the pandemic, COVID-19. On November 9th, 2020, the whole world came together to celebrate the news that the first vaccine against the virus was proving successful. Barely a month and a half later, the first doses began to be administered. With these vaccines, not only did we start to invert the trend of the pandemic, we also reversed the pessimism of a world that had come to question whether things would ever return to normal. The vaccine represents many things, but above all else, as far as I'm concerned, it's the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Because in just 2 years, the world has managed to develop not one, not two, but 40 vaccines against COVID-19. Through COVAX, more than 2 billion doses have been allocated to developing countries. Massive vaccination campaigns have enabled us to control the spread of the virus and return to normality in many countries. However, it is clear that much remains to be done. That cannot be refuted. There is so much still to be done in this pandemic because there is an outrageous degree of inequality between countries as regards to access to the vaccine. It's insulting. Also, it's to the detriment of humanity as a whole because a virus cannot be eradicated if its spread is not halted in every corner of the planet, in every country. Spain, my country, was impacted significantly by this pandemic, and we want to be a part of the global solution for this enormous challenge, this pandemic and future pandemics that we may have to face. We will contribute 15 million euros to the Financial Intermediary Fund for Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response, and we support the adoption of a legally binding international instrument for this purpose by the World Health Organization, and thereby strengthen an institution that has been key to the global response in face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our indebtedness to science also demands that we act in other areas that may have been neglected in the race against the virus. We must, for example, step up our efforts and promote scientific research to guarantee universal access to medical care and treatment. And Spain, in this regard, intends to allocate more than 237 million euros of its official development assistance to health-related issues over the next 3 years, including 130 million euros for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The second major challenge that I would like to share with all of you, and that I want to speak of, has to do with the food crisis currently threatening millions of human beings. This is a complex problem that has the potential to deteriorate yet further in 2023 if we do not implement measures, because this has been heightened by Russia's blockade of grain exports from Ukraine, but also by selfish decisions to erect barriers to trade in agricultural products and fertilizers. As co-sponsor of the Leaders Network Reinforcing Multilateralism Together, I co-chaired, together with the President of Senegal and Chairperson of the African Union, the President of the European Council, and the U.S. Secretary of State, the Food Security Summit. This looked at the current crisis, food crisis that everyone all over the world is facing. It gathered world leaders from all regions, especially those most affected by this crisis, and we adopted a joint declaration renewing our commitment to deal with the crisis. The meeting had a very clear purpose, I believe, to address this challenge and to seek solutions with urgency. And I also said at this meeting that Spain would lead by example. We will mobilize 151 million euros in donations and a further 85 million euros in loans over the next 3 years to this end. Ladies and gentlemen, this action is consistent with Spain's commitment to combating inequality and poverty the world over, a commitment that is exemplified in the new Cooperation Act, which provides that Spain will allocate 0.7% of its gross national income to official development assistance by 2030. The third major challenge I wish to discuss moving forward has to do with the climate emergency and the need to foster an ecological transition with urgency and determination. It's clear that the current energy crisis requires us to invest decisively in more sustainable energy models and to increase our energy independence, thereby making us more resilient. We must diversify, electrify, and decarbonize our energy mix for the following two reasons. Firstly, to prevent countries from using their energy resources as a weapon of war, which is what Putin's regime is doing, which is done in an effort to blackmail the entire planet, pushing up inflation and jeopardizing the necessary recovery of many economies who have suffered, truly suffered, because of the pandemic. And secondly, because in order to respond to the fundamental and increasingly evident challenge faced by our generation and those yet to come, that of climate change, we have to redouble our efforts in this transition. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that this is something that drives us to be more determined than ever to fulfill the commitments made to decarbonize our economies and our societies. It's not a matter of whether or not this is convenient for us, decarbonizing our economies. It's a matter of how to do so fairly and with the speed demanded by science, because time is running out. Spain, in this respect, also wishes to put forward specific solutions within the United Nations. Together with Senegal, we will support the creation of an international alliance for drought resilience to promote innovation, technology transfer, and the mobilization of resources to combat droughts in countries exposed to this threat. Spain is also a country that suffers this potential threat. We will present this initiative at the COP27 in Egypt in conjunction with the Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and with other interested countries. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the energy crisis is placing a strain on every country in Europe, including my own, and it is because of how hardly hit the majority of our societies have been, especially the middle and working classes, because all measures being adopted to reduce its impact are based on a common principle, that this time the costs and sacrifices will not be borne by that vast majority of citizens which has already suffered too much in previous crises. I'm talking specifically here about the financial crisis. That is what comes to mind. And Spain has promoted far-reaching regulatory reforms to reduce the impact of rising gas prices. But we are well aware also, and this has been mentioned by the Secretary General of the United Nations, we are aware of the need to continue working, and we have done so over the last year, to overhaul the electricity sector throughout the European Union. This is the moment to bring the sector closer into line with today's reality by limiting and distributing the costs and benefits of price increases more fairly. And that is the commitment that my country has adopted. The fourth great challenge that I want to address concerns the digital transformation and its impact on the future of education and employment today and tomorrow. Just this Monday, Spain participated in a session of the Transforming Education Summit that was dedicated to digital transformation of education. At this session, we evoked the lessons of the pandemic, stressing that technological solutions had made it possible to overcome the barriers that were making in-person teaching impossible. I'm talking here about our children, our sons, our daughters, and in this particular context, Spain aspires to playing a leading role in this sphere. For example, the UN Technology Center for the Digitalization of Education, GIGA, will be established in Barcelona thanks to Spain's collaboration with UNICEF and the International Telecommunication Union. Education, ladies and gentlemen, is the key. It is the path towards making our societies more informed and aware, and hence freer, more inclusive, and more equal. If we wish to achieve further advances in human rights, in our human rights agenda, then we must continue to support the right to education for all, but especially for girls. It is there, in school, where the path towards gender equality and the empowerment of women really starts. That said, I would now like to talk about the fifth and final topic that I want to address today, namely the feminist agenda and the struggle for gender equality. We are living in times in which demanding basic rights is still a revolutionary act. The global threats to women's sexual and reproductive freedom are yet another example of how painfully slow the glacial pace at which the world is moving towards guaranteeing full equality between women and men. Worse still is the fragility of our past social gains, which have fallen victim to backsliding in certain advanced democracies, something quite inexplicable at this stage of the 21st century. Spain will continue to be at the forefront of this endeavor, with the adoption of the new organic law for the comprehensive guarantee of sexual freedom and the future Act on Sexual and Reproductive Health, which will help ensure that public health services continue to attend to women and meet all their needs throughout our country. In this respect, I would like to announce that Spain will lead by example, and we will contribute 100 million euros over the next 3 years to organizations that work on matters of gender equality, especially reproductive and sexual rights, looking at UN Women particularly here. It is essential that we listen to women's voices, that we eradicate the barriers, all barriers, preventing them from taking their rightful place in companies, in governments, and in working for peace. And so I invite each one of you to compare images from 20, 30, or 40 years ago. Compare your family photos, the ones you have at home, with the images that appeared in the media at that time in your countries. In both cases, you may be surprised. If you look at Spain, for example, you might even be amused to see how much we've changed in fashion, appearance, customs, smoking indoors. Everything has changed. But comparing such images, you will notice an inexcusable discrepancy: the presence of women in your family photos and their absence from public images, reflecting the political and economic realities of the times. We have made great progress in equality between women and men, but much remains to be done, and nothing is guaranteed, as we saw just a few months ago in Afghanistan when the Taliban returned to power. Ladies and gentlemen, last month I had the privilege of visiting the Center for Memory, Peace, and Reconciliation in the capital of Colombia, Bogota. I was able to witness firsthand the efforts made by an entire people, and especially its women, to move on from the past, to pay reparations to the victims, and to build a society free from violence. Colombia is embarking upon a new era of hope and of peace building, and Spain will be at its side, ready to lend our support. The countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have a fundamental role to play in the world, beginning with the defense of democracy, all to support multilateralism. However, the region also needs international support, including in the fight against drug trafficking. Spain is more committed than ever to Latin America and the Caribbean, and we will work to tighten EU relations with this region during our presidency of the Council of the European Union in the second half of the coming year. We want Europe to strengthen its perspective concerning Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at things so basic as revitalizing a fundamental alliance between these two regions and giving more attention to our southern neighborhood. Our intention is for the priorities I have just mentioned to inform and guide our actions during those 6 months in Europe, and that is precisely what I believe will occur during that second half of the year 2023. We will look at the green transition, the digital transition, as well as the social one, which will set the path that Spain will take during its presidency of the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is a project of stability and harmony, a project of peace, which we would wish to see reflected in other areas of the planet, beginning with Ukraine. It is clear that we must continue to work to ensure that other countries and regions, in addition to Ukraine, also recover their stability. We are making headway in the negotiations to reach a nuclear agreement with Iran, in which the European Union, I believe, is playing an essential role. But we have seen, very recently, how the tensions in the East China Sea are threatening the status quo in a region that is key for both the present and the future of humanity. Asia's importance to global security was made very clear at the NATO summit held last June in Madrid, earlier this year, with the alliance's Pacific partners participating for the first time ever at the highest level. We adopted a new strategic concept for the organization for the next 10 years. In Madrid, we welcomed 2 new members, Consolidated Democracy, Sweden and Finland, and approved the alliance's new strategic concept, which will guide its future in the coming years. That concept offers a refined diagnosis of an increasingly complex strategic environment. It features a significant mention of the alliance's southern flank and in particular the Sahel, a region afflicted by growing instability. as well as growing terrorism. We must pay attention to the risks that are highly present in the region, such as irregular flows of migrants and, again, the threat of terrorism. Said threats may soon be exacerbated by the cumulative effects of the food and energy crises, climate change, and demographic trends. We must leave the conflicts of the past century behind. That is why, as regards Western Sahara, Spain supports a mutually acceptable political solution in the framework of the UN Charter and Security Council resolutions. In this regard, we fully support the work of the UN Secretary Special Envoy, work that we deem to be absolutely crucial. Spain will also continue to support the Sahrawi population in the refugee camps, as it always has done, as the principal international donor, as the main international donor of humanitarian assistance in this context. Also, as I had said during last year's session, on 31 December 2020, Spain and the United Kingdom reached a bilateral understanding in the context of the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union with respect to Gibraltar. We have been working since that date to ensure that said understanding serves to lay the foundations for the future relationship of this territory with the European Union, trusting that, as quickly as possible, an agreement may be reached between the European Union and the United Kingdom in relation to Gibraltar. This agreement must fully respect UN doctrine regarding said territory, with which Spain is fully aligned, and it must too respect the legal position of my country as concerns the sovereignty and jurisdiction thereof. We wish to work for the development of an area of social and economic prosperity encompassing Gibraltar fully and the Campo of Gibraltar in its entirety. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, as I had said in the beginning of my statement, I spoke of two feelings: the trust I have in the future and confidence in this institution, the United Nations. 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, we feared we might never again live in a world in which people could shake hands, hug each other, kiss each other. We came to the point of believing that such gestures of courtesy and affection would be additional collateral victims of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, that world, which seemed out of reach, is already back, something we've seen many times throughout human history, something that arises when society has been faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, and yet hope, as always, will lead the way, sometimes with a push from science and knowledge, and other times simply due to our will not to repeat the fatal errors of the past. I think humanity will always find a way to overcome the blows it is dealt and continue moving forward, because what matters, what makes us a difference, is how we deal with these crises, how we heal the wounds inflicted upon us along the way, while at the same time protecting the most vulnerable, the most exposed. We must be guided, ladies and gentlemen, by the values and principles that we all adhere to as members of this noble and important organization, in which Spain once again wishes to express its utmost trust. We must preserve in our efforts an ambition to build a world that is freer, more prosperous, and more just. And to this end, we must strengthen rules-based multilateralism and, in short, that we strive to guarantee peace, the most valuable asset we can possess. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Government of Spain for the statement just made and request the protocol to escort His Excellency.